The year was 1829 and spring had just begun to breathe life across the mid-Atlantic countryside. The rolling fields near the Delaware, Maryland border looked peaceful, rows of tobacco stretching out under a pale sky, oak trees shaking off the last grip of winter. To any outsider, it was an ordinary morning in rural America. But beneath that soil lay a horror that would soon surface, a darkness that had been buried for decades. A tenant farmer, exhausted from hours of plowing, guided his horse across the damp earth. Suddenly, the animal stumbled, its hooves sinking into something soft and hollow. Startled, the farmer pulled the horse back and began digging into the ground. Within moments, his shovel struck wood. A rotten, splintering wooden chest emerged from the soil, its iron hinges nearly dissolved by time. When he pried it open, a stench of decay rushed out. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a human being. The skull was cracked, and the long bones were yellowed with age. The farmer froze, his heart racing, as he realized he had uncovered a grave, a hidden tomb no one was meant to find. Word spread quickly. By evening, local authorities arrived, and excavation of the land began. What they unearthed was not one body, but many over the next several days. Bones surfaced from shallow pits, sometimes whole skeletons, sometimes fragments mixed with soil. At least *7 individuals were confirmed, including the tiny skeletons of 3 children. The community recoiled in shock. Who could be responsible for such deliberate cruelty? Whispers spread faster than the news itself. This was the work of a woman already infamous in secret conversations across the Delmarva Peninsula, Patty Cannon. By the 1820s, Patty Cannon was no stranger to the people of Delaware and Maryland. Her name carried a weight of terror, spoken only in hushed voices, especially among free black families who feared the night knock on the door. She was not just a criminal. She was a legend of horror, a shadow that preyed upon the most vulnerable. For nearly 20 years, Patty Cannon had run what historians now call the reverse Underground Railroad. Unlike the heroic network that carried enslaved people to freedom, her empire dragged them the other way. She and her gang kidnapped free African Americans and fugitive slaves, chaining them, hiding them, and selling them back into bondage in the Deep South. But human trafficking alone did not define her. Cannon was a killer. Rival traders disappeared, witnesses vanished, and even children were murdered when they threatened her operation. Some say she killed with her own hands. Others believed she orchestrated murders through her gang. The truth, buried in fragments of testimony and court records, paints her not only as a trafficker of flesh but also as a serial murderer. Cold, merciless, and calculating. The bones discovered in 1829 confirmed what many had long suspected. Patty Cannon's farm was a graveyard, an empire of terror. To understand how she thrived, one must understand the land she ruled. The Cannon homestead sat in a peculiar spot, right along the Delaware-Maryland border near a place then called Johnson's Crossroads. It was a wilderness of pine forests, marshlands, and scattered farmsteads. Isolated, desolate, and perfect for crime. Jurisdictional confusion added to her 3 counties, Sussex in Delaware, Caroline and Dorchester in Maryland, all intersected nearby. Lawmen chasing her gang could be stopped dead simply by crossing into another county. Justice had borders. Outlaws did not. The tavern at Johnson's Crossroads became the headquarters of her gang. To travelers, it looked like an ordinary inn, a place to drink ale and rest a weary horse. But behind its walls, men were chained, gagged, and beaten. Secret chambers held captives until they could be marched southward in iron shackles, destined for slave markets in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. Complex, its dark waters carried boats filled with the kidnapped, slipping past watchful eyes under the cover of night. Roads were nothing but rough cart paths, hours from the nearest town, ensuring that screams for help vanished into the woods unheard. It was, in every sense, the perfect hunting ground for a predator like Patty Cannon. Who was she, this woman who struck terror across the borderlands? Records suggest she was born around 1760, possibly under the name Lucretia Patricia Hanley, though even her birth remains shrouded in mystery. Some accounts claim she was Canadian-born, arriving in Delaware as a young woman. Others believe she was of Irish descent. What is certain is that she married Jesse Cannon ***, a farmer with modest land near the border. Their home was an unremarkable two-story structure with thick timber walls and narrow windows, the kind common in that era. But behind its plain appearance, Patty engineered secret spaces, rooms designed to hide human beings like stolen goods. Neighbors described Jesse as a quiet, reserved man, perhaps too weak to resist his wife's iron will. Together they had at least one daughter, but it was Patty who carved her legacy, not as a mother or wife, but as a predator cloaked in respectability. By day, she was a farmer's wife. By night, she was the architect of terror. A changing America. The timing of her rise was no coincidence. The early 1800s marked a turning point in the American slave economy. In *1808, Congress banned the importation of enslaved Africans. The transatlantic slave trade was officially over. But the demand for human labor in the cotton fields was only just beginning. Cotton was booming. The invention of the cotton gin had turned the Gulf Coast states into a gold mine. Fields of white stretched endlessly, and planters grew desperate for laborers to pick, plant, and die in those fields. With no new supply from Africa, prices for enslaved people soared. A strong man who once sold for $300 before the ban could now fetch more than $1,000 in the Deep South. The market was insatiable. Criminals like Patty Cannon stepped into this economic void. Where others saw moral outrage, she saw profit. The free black families of Delaware and Maryland became her hunting ground. Men walking home from work, women fetching water, even children playing in fields. No one was safe. Kidnapped, shackled, hidden, and transported, their lives were sold for cash. Their existence erased from communities that could do little to fight back. And those who resisted, those who might talk, they were buried in the soil, their bones waiting for a farmer's plow to one day reveal their fate. For thousands, the discovery of the bones in 1829 was not just a crime scene. It was an opening into a hidden empire that had thrived for decades. What investigators began piecing together was more than murder. It was an industry. Patty Cannon did not work alone. She commanded a gang of outlaws, men whose loyalty was bought with money, alcohol, and blood. Among them were notorious kidnappers, slave traders, and drifters who knew no law but her word. Some were her relatives. Her own son-in-law, Joe Johnson, was one of her most ruthless partners. Together, they created a machine of human misery. Their methods were simple but terrifyingly effective. At night, they roamed the countryside, slipping through forests and across marshes, targeting isolated cabins where free black families lived. Knocks on the door in the dead of night often ended with violence. A man could be dragged from his bed, bound in chains, and gone before dawn. A child could vanish from a field, never to be seen again. Entire families sometimes disappeared without explanation. Neighbors left to wonder if they had simply moved west, or if the shadows had taken them. And when questions arose, silence followed. Witnesses were threatened, beaten, or killed outright. Fear was the most powerful weapon in Patty Cannon's arsenal. At the heart of this operation was the tavern at Johnson's Crossroads. By day, it looked like a typical roadside inn, a place for weary travelers to drink ale, swap stories, and rest their horses. But behind closed doors, its walls echoed with screams. Captives were chained in the cellar, their mouths gagged to smother cries for help. Others were locked in upstairs rooms, windows shuttered and guarded by Patty's gang. Merchants and planters from the south sometimes visited the tavern under the guise of customers, inspecting the goods before arranging secret sales. It was not just a house of drink and laughter. It was a warehouse of stolen lives. Those who resisted too fiercely often disappeared. Some were beaten to death, their bodies dumped in shallow graves. Others were poisoned or strangled when they became too troublesome to transport. Even children were not spared. One witness later claimed Patty herself once smashed a child's head against a wall to silence him. Whether myth or truth, the story spread like wildfire, cementing her image as a monster in human form. The chilling part was how ordinary life seemed to continue above the horror. To neighbors, Patty was a tough but respectable woman who managed her family's affairs after her husband Jesse's decline. Her daughter and grandchildren lived under her roof. By day, smoke curled from the chimney, and the Cannon homestead looked no different from any other farm. But behind the facade, prisoners languished in hidden rooms. A false wall in the attic, a trapdoor beneath the floorboards. These were the spaces where stolen people were crammed, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, until they were marched southward in iron chains. Imagine the silence of that house at night. A family sitting at supper while muffled cries seeped through the walls. Children laughing, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit that human beings were imprisoned just feet away. It was horror disguised as normality, cruelty woven into daily life. By the 1810s and 1820s, the domestic slave trade had become one of the most profitable industries in the United States. The Deep South's hunger for labor was insatiable, and prices for enslaved people rose to staggering levels. Patty Cannon and her gang exploited this hunger with ruthless precision. They kidnapped dozens, perhaps hundreds, of free African Americans from Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and even New Jersey. Once captured, victims were forced on foot across states, tied together in lines called coffles, their necks shackled to iron collars. Some were transported by river, loaded into boats that slipped silently down the Nanticoke and onward to the Chesapeake. The journey south was brutal. Many died along the way from exhaustion, starvation, or beatings. Those who survived were sold at auction blocks in places like Georgia and Mississippi, their names erased, their identities replaced with numbers and prices. For every human life she destroyed, Patty Cannon grew wealthier. Her tavern and homestead became symbols of her thriving empire of blood. Free black families across Delaware and Maryland lived under constant dread. Parents warned children never to wander far, never to trust strangers, never to open the door at night. Churches became sanctuaries where sermons were filled with pleas for protection against kidnappers. But fear alone could not shield them. Too often, the kidnappers struck with impunity, and the law offered little help. Local authorities, many of whom were complicit or indifferent, turned a blind eye. In some cases, officials themselves profited from the trade. Racial prejudice ensured that missing black neighbors rarely drew serious investigation. The silence was deafening. Entire communities watched as families disappeared, knowing who was responsible but powerless to act. Patty Cannon's name became a curse spoken under breath, her shadow stretching far beyond her homestead. Over time, her crimes escalated from abduction to outright murder. Court records from Sussex County, Delaware, eventually indicted her for at least 4 murders, though locals believed the true number was far higher, perhaps more than *20. Victims included rival slave traders who crossed her, debtors who threatened her profits, and witnesses who dared to speak. She killed not only for money but for silence, ensuring her empire remained untouchable. Her cruelty was not hidden. It was whispered, feared, and known. Yet she walked freely, protected by geography, corruption, and terror. For nearly 2 decades, her reign endured, a dark testament to how evil can flourish when unchecked. By 1829, the truth could no longer remain buried. The farmer's accidental discovery of the chest of bones was the crack that broke the dam. For years, people had whispered that Patty Cannon's land was cursed, that the soil itself was heavy with secrets. Now the ground had spoken. The bodies told a story that words never could. Broken skulls, tiny rib cages, jawbones with teeth still intact. Each was evidence of lives taken and silenced. Each was a reminder of how far one woman's cruelty had reached. Authorities could no longer ignore what lay beneath their feet. The hunt for justice was about to begin. The discovery of the bones had shattered the silence. What for years had been whispered in taverns and churchyards was now laid bare in the soil. Patty Cannon's empire was built on murder. The farmer who uncovered the chest had unwittingly lit a fuse that would set the entire region ablaze. Word spread across Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Patty Cannon's farm was a graveyard, her tavern a prison, her name a curse confirmed by bones. For the first time, lawmen could not look away. Authorities began questioning locals, farmers, travelers, even former associates of Patty's gang. The stories spilled out like blood from an old wound. One man admitted he had seen chained captives marched from the tavern under cover of darkness. Another described screams echoing from Cannon's cellar. A woman claimed she had once glimpsed a child locked in an upstairs room, only for the child to vanish the next day. The most damning testimony came from members of her own gang, some, facing prison themselves, turned against her. They described how Patty ordered murders, how she personally struck captives, and how she profited from every life stolen. Court records later revealed she was indicted for 4 murders, but investigators believed the real number was far higher. The skeletal remains found on her land seemed to confirm that belief. Patty Cannon was no ordinary criminal. She was a woman in a world dominated by men, yet she commanded fear and respect even among hardened killers. Her voice carried authority. Her reputation demanded obedience. Witnesses described her as tall, broad-shouldered, with a stern face and piercing eyes. Some said she dressed plainly, blending into rural life, while others swore she carried herself with a sinister pride. But what unsettled people most was her lack of remorse. She did not deny her role. She did not weep for the dead. If anything, she seemed amused by the horror her name inspired. By 1829, pressure mounted. Authorities could no longer excuse her crimes, not with bones rising from the ground. A posse of lawmen descended on her homestead. The arrest was swift but tense. Some accounts claim Patty surrendered quietly, her eyes cold, her mouth curved in a faint smile. Others insist she cursed and fought, spitting at the men who dared lay hands on her. What is certain is that she was shackled and taken from the house that had concealed so many captives, led through crowds of neighbors who watched in grim silence. For years, they had whispered her name in fear. Now they saw her paraded as a criminal at last. Patty was imprisoned in Georgetown, Delaware, the county seat. Her cell was small, with iron bars that rattled whenever she moved. Outside, crowds gathered, curious to glimpse the infamous woman who had terrorized their land for 2 decades. Inside, she remained eerily calm. Some guards later claimed she laughed to herself in the night. Others said she muttered prayers. Perhaps she was mocking heaven, or perhaps she was bargaining with it. Newspapers across the Mid-Atlantic seized the story. Headlines branded her the female monster, the pirate of the borderlands, and the queen of kidnappers. For readers, she was both horrifying and fascinating. A woman who had defied gender roles by becoming something far darker than most men dared. A grand jury indicted her on multiple counts, including *4 confirmed murders. Witnesses were prepared to testify about kidnappings, trafficking, and killings. Authorities believed the trial would reveal the full extent of her crimes. But justice is rarely so neat. The legal system in 1829 was fragile, and cases involving free black victims were often dismissed or ignored. Many of those kidnapped had no family with the power to demand accountability. The law had failed them in life. Would it fail them in death as well? Still, Patty Cannon faced enough evidence to ensure conviction. The bones, the testimonies, the sheer weight of fear she had inspired, her empire was crumbling. As she sat in her cell awaiting trial, people speculated about her thoughts. Did she regret the killings? Did she fear the gallows? Or did she believe she had been invincible until the very end? Some accounts suggest she remained defiant, refusing to show remorse. Others claim she expressed bitterness, not for her victims, but for being caught. To many, she seemed less like a woman awaiting judgment and more like a predator caged at last. Before the trial could begin, fate, or perhaps Patty herself, intervened. In May of 1829, she was found dead in her cell. Reports claimed she had taken poison, ending her own life rather than face the noose. Whether smuggled in by sympathizers or hidden in her belongings, the poison gave her control over her final act. She denied the public the spectacle of her hanging. She denied the families of her victims the justice of watching her punishment. Just as she had lived, she died on her own terms, cold, calculating, and merciless. Patty Cannon's death left behind more questions than answers. How many had she truly killed? How many families had she destroyed? The exact number will never be known. Her body was buried without ceremony, her grave unmarked. But her name lived on, whispered for generations across Delaware and Maryland. Parents warned children not to wander, invoking her memory as a ghostly threat. Historians wrote of her as one of America's earliest serial killers, a woman whose crimes blurred the line between true history and dark legend. The farmhouse where she once lived eventually crumbled, but the land remained stained by its past. Locals said the soil was cursed, that crops grew poorly where the bones had been found. Some claimed to hear screams on quiet nights, echoes of captives long dead. Even now, 2 centuries later, the story of Patty Cannon unsettles anyone who hears it. She was not just a kidnapper. She was not just a murderer. She was a reminder that the worst monsters are sometimes human. 900 for 1,000. The spring of 1829 arrived heavy with whispers across the borderland of Delaware and Maryland. For decades, the name Patty Cannon had spread fear like wildfire. Parents warned their children not to wander near the crossroads after dark. Free black families lived in constant dread, for they knew the shadow of Patty's gang could fall upon them at any hour. But that spring, the empire she had built on blood and human misery was finally beginning to crumble. It began with a farmer plowing a field not far from Johnson's Crossroads. His plow struck something hard, and when he leaned down to clear the earth, what he uncovered was not stone but bone. The skull of a child stared up at him, hollow-eyed, from the soil. Word spread quickly. Sheriff's deputies and neighbors arrived, and soon more bones were unearthed, dozens of them. Some skeletons bore the marks of shackles, their wrists still bound in rusted iron. Others were small, heartbreakingly small, suggesting that children had been buried in shallow graves near the Cannon homestead. The earth itself seemed to exhale the cries of the forgotten. The townspeople began to murmur what many had long suspected, that Patty Cannon's house was more than just a home. It was a slaughterhouse. When the sheriff finally rode up to Patty's house with armed men, the once proud building stood like a fortress of secrets. Its wooden beams groaned in the wind, and its shuttered windows seemed to glare back at the intruders. Inside, investigators discovered horrors that few could ever forget. Trapdoors leading to secret cellars, iron chains fastened to beams, hidden rooms with straw-covered floors, where captives had been kept like livestock. A heavy stench lingered in the air, a mix of mildew, sweat, and something fouler that time could not fully erase. Behind one wall, deputies discovered a narrow crawlspace. In it lay the skeletal remains of at least half a dozen people. One officer later wrote that the silence of the house was broken only by the sound of boots crunching over human bones. Neighbors who had once looked away could no longer deny the truth. Patty Cannon had been living among them as both neighbor and monster. Patty was arrested in 1829. By then she was nearly 70 years old, but she remained a terrifying figure. Witnesses described her as broad-shouldered, with sharp, piercing eyes that seemed to see through lies. Some said her hair had gone stark white, giving her the appearance of a ghost already halfway to the grave. The charges brought against her were staggering: kidnapping, murder, slave trading, conspiracy. Witnesses, many of them former gang members or neighbors too afraid to speak before, now came forward. They told of black families dragged screaming from their homes, of children snatched from roadsides, of victims chained in Patty's cellar until they could be marched south to the slave markets of Georgia and Mississippi. But the most chilling testimony was not about trafficking. It was about murder. Several witnesses swore that Patty herself had killed those who could not be sold: babies, the elderly, the weak. One story told how she struck down an infant against a fireplace stone because its cries threatened to expose her hiding place. The court recoiled in horror. The newspapers dubbed her the female monster and the tigress of the Eastern Shore. Asterisk, never before had the young nation seen a woman accused of such atrocities. Patty remained unrepentant. During her confinement, she reportedly laughed when guards asked if she feared the gallows. "I've sent many a soul to the grave," she sneered, "and I'll not tremble at meeting them." Yet cracks began to show. Rumors swirled that other inmates in the jail feared her presence, claiming she muttered to herself at night, speaking to shadows that no one else could see. One prisoner swore he heard the cries of children echoing from her cell, though no children were there. Some said that the ghosts of her victims had come to claim her before the hangman could. In May of 1829, just before her execution, Patty Cannon was found dead in her cell. Official records state that she swallowed poison, perhaps smuggled in by a sympathizer, perhaps hidden on her person. Others whispered that she had been strangled in the night by unseen hands, her face frozen in a look of terror. The jailers buried her in an unmarked grave. But even in death, she inspired dread. Townspeople claimed that the earth above her grave never settled, as if it refused to hold her body. Some swore that her ghost wandered the crossroads near her old tavern, a pale figure calling out in the night, forever hunting for new victims. The discovery of her crimes shook the Delmarva Peninsula to its core. For decades, stories of Patty Cannon served as both history and warning. Parents told their children not to stray near the crossroads, lest Patty's spirit snatch them away. Writers recorded her tale in pamphlets and ballads, cementing her place as one of the most infamous criminals in early America. But beyond the folklore lies a grim truth. Patty Cannon was not merely a figure of myth. She was flesh and blood, a woman who exploited the weaknesses of law and society to profit from human misery. She thrived in a time when racial prejudice and jurisdictional confusion allowed her crimes to go unchecked. Her story reminds us that evil is not always the work of distant tyrants or faceless systems. Sometimes it takes root in ordinary homes, in neighbors we think we know, in the very soil beneath our feet. And sometimes it wears the face of a woman smiling across the tavern table, while hiding a cellar full of chains. White heavy checkmark ready. In the silence of the night, every sound is sharper. The ticking of the clock, the whisper of wind brushing against the wall, and the occasional soft tap of rain on the window pane. Wilson, a quiet 13-year-old boy, was accompanying his mother, Ella, to a second-hand sale at an old, desolate house. The air inside felt wrong. The walls seemed to have swallowed centuries of secrets. The smell of aged wood mixed with a faint odor of rust and dampness. Wilson's eyes locked onto a glass display case in the corner. Inside the case, she was there. Her blue eyes gleamed like glass, her smile stretched unervingly wide, her ears small and rabbit-like, and her golden fur seemed to shimmer even under the dim, tired light. The moment Wilson saw her, a cold shiver slid down his spine. After a bit of begging, Ella gave in and bought the doll. Back home, Wilson placed Lavuvu on a shelf and sat down to do his homework. But his eyes kept drifting toward the doll. It felt like she was silently calling him, like she might change the moment he blinked. He got up and started playing with her. But then his mother called him downstairs. The second he set the doll back and turned away, a heavy metal trophy from the upper shelf came crashing down, right where he'd been standing. If he hadn't moved, that could have been the end of his story. In the days that followed, strange things began happening in the house. Light bulbs suddenly shorted out. Window glass cracked without reason. Objects fell to the floor with loud, startling crashes. And Lavuvu, her smile was stretching, wider, sharper, more sinister. Day by day, Wilson told his father. His dad laughed it off, saying it was just his imagination. Still, to comfort him, he took the doll and promised to throw it away at the dump the next day. That night, a loud thud shook the house. Wilson woke up and froze. Lavuvu was right next to his face. Her blue eyes were icy cold now, her smile even wider than before. Then he heard his father scream from downstairs. Wilson rushed down and found his dad at the bottom of the staircase, badly hurt. The next morning, Ella threw the doll in the outside trash bin. Wilson felt relieved, until that night, when the rocking chair in the living room began moving on its own. As he stepped closer, his breath caught in his throat. The Lavuvu doll was sitting on it. This time, her eyes moved and they locked directly onto his. One day, Wilson tossed the doll onto the school playground, hoping to be done with her. His friend Chris laughed, picked it up, and handed it back. Suddenly, a baseball flew at full speed, smashing into Chris's head. He collapsed, and a long, rusty nail on the ground drove straight into his skull. Death was instant. That night, Wilson tore the Lavuvu doll apart and burned the pieces. But when he woke, she was back, sitting in his room, smiling, laughing, a deep, twisted laugh from somewhere inside her. In the morning, his body was covered in bite marks. Terrified, his parents called a priest. The priest took one look at Lavuvu and said, "This is no toy. This is a starving, malevolent spirit." He locked her inside a reinforced iron box and buried it near the same house where Wilson had first found her. The next day, the priest died in a car accident. Wilson and his parents left the city. The doll never came back. But even now, when the night is deep and the wind taps gently at the window, Wilson sometimes hears a faint chuckle right in his early. It's ready for recording. Shall I prepare that next?